Welcome to Module 1, Units 2 and 3. In this brief unit, we're going to look at the term mummy. We're going to make sure that we're all on the same page with defining exactly what a mummy is. We're going to look at the term from its origin to its present-day use and right on up to a 21st century definition. So we'll all understand what we're talking about when we use the term mummy. Also, briefly, we're going to look at what's called the taxonomy or classification of mummies. In some parts of the world, they have a variety of mummies, but some fall into different classifications. For example, accidental and intentional mummification are some examples of the taxonomy or classification. So we're going to look at those so that when we're looking at mummies within specific cultures, we're able to place them into their proper classification. So let's move on first then into defining the term mummy. The term mummy comes from the word mumia, which is ancient Prussian, which it means asphalt. It's the word for asphalt or bitumen, which was a naturally occurring substance that oozed from fissures in the Middle East, particularly near Babylon. And as you can see in the picture here, it's a gooey, sticky substance. It's just like the asphalt, essentially, that we use on the surface of our roads in North America. So as you can imagine, this was a pretty unique substance. Now, mumia was used by 13th and 18th century physicians as a treatment for a variety of ills. They would take the mumia and put it on wounds or ulcers that were on the skin or the surface of the body. And ultimately, some of these wounds and ulcers actually healed. And the reason for that is probably because the bitumen, the asphalt, the mumia that was placed on the skin created a barrier so that exogenous bacteria from outside the body, couldn't enter the wound and cause an infection. The other thing it probably did was even kill the surface bacteria on the skin in and around the wound, because even surface bacteria on our skin, when we get a cut or a wound, if that surface bacteria gets inside the body, that can create an infection as well. So it probably did have some healing characteristics to it. But they used it, as you can see, for a number of centuries. But there was a great demand for mumia, and eventually the demand exceeded the supply of mumia, or the asphalt, from the Middle East. So the resins that were used on mummified Egyptians were substituted for the asphalt. The name mummy was then transferred from the asphalt, or the bitumen, to resins. Now the resins, remember, once again, came from Egypt. Well, actually near Egypt. They had to travel to get the resins, and they would put it on the mummified bodies. But of course, prior to putting those resins on the mummified bodies, the physicians hopefully would get hold of the resin and use it for medicinal purposes. And when they did, the European physicians claimed that the resins were superior to the asphalt. Now, maybe it was. We don't know, but maybe simply because they could get more of the resins than they could the asphalt, claiming that the resins were superior to the asphalt may have only served to improve their marketability of the resins that they were attaining. Now, in the resins collected from mummified Egyptians, now remember, resins was available, but it wasn't very prevalent there in Egypt. They had to travel to get the resin, and they would put the resin on mummified bodies. So in the resins collected from mummified Egyptians, there were fragments of preserved human tissues. So the term mumia was again transferred initially from the asphalt to the resin, and now from the resin to the preserved human tissues that were stuck in that resin. And once again, claims were made that this was important. The mummified tissue, the mummies, were actually ground up and used for medicine, used in drinks, used as a color pigment. So not only were they used medicinally, but they were used for other aspects of culture in Europe in the 13th to 18th centuries. So mumia began as, and the Europeans called it mummy because they really didn't pronounce mumia too well. It started as the asphalt, transferred to the resin, and now to preserved human tissues. And the term did specifically refer to non-skeletal or soft tissues, and continued to be employed as medical agents, as I mentioned. Now, mumia made its final transition to the term mummy in the late 18th century. There was a decrease in the use of mummy or mumia, or the resins with body parts in it, flaky skin, as medicine, and the term made its final transfer to any form of mummified remains. human remains, plant remains, or animal remains. As you can see in the picture here on the far left, we have a group of human mummies. These are from Guanajuato, Mexico. This is the Museo de las Momias. We'll be talking about that quite a bit in the course. In the center is mummified, preserved corn. It doesn't decay. That's what mummification really means. And this is very typical. These ears of corn, come from the Atacama Desert in South America. These cobs were often placed with the deceased and to carry on as food in their version of what the afterlife may have been. And many cultures, we know that Egyptians mummified animals. Well, in Peru, they mummified animals as well. This is an image of a mummified dog from near the town of Ilo, Peru, in southern Peru, near northern Chile. So anything that resisted decay, human, plant, or animal, was called a mummy. Finally, in the 21st century, a colleague of mine, Dr. After Heidi, in 2004, in his book, The Scientific Study of Mummies, came up with a definition that we now embrace. So this is a very modern definition. The modern definition of a mummy is a physically preserved corpse or tissue that resembles its living morphology, but resists further decay for a prolonged post-mortem interval. And by extension, referring not only to humans' corpse, animal corpse, and plants as well. And what I have depicted for you here is a picture of a hand, a mummified hand. Jerry and I have done a lot of work with Ripley's Believe It or Not, and this is a hand they ask us to analyze to determine its authenticity. And the reason I've used it in this image on this slide is that, as After Heidi said, it can be a physically preserved corpse or tissue that resembles its living morphology. And here we have a hand. Now, we don't have a whole body, so this would be called a mummified hand. If we just had the skin of that hand, but it was mummified and we could tell that it was skin resembling its living morphology, it would be mummified skin. We could have a mummified finger. We could have a mummified limb, as in the case the hand. We could have a whole mummified body. In Phoenix, Arizona, with the last few years, there was a body that they found that had died in an apartment, and someone had put it in a bathtub and buried that body almost all the way in sand. Now, it was really interesting because the body above the sand decayed, but the part of the body that was below the sand was mummified. So here we had a complete corpse who was partially mummified, half mummified from the body down. A fascinating case. Now that we know what a mummy is, and now you'll be actually making mummified tissue later on in the course, it's important for us to put these mummies into the proper categories. So we're going to look now at how we classify mummies. What are the classification of mummies? What are their different types? And here are the general types of mummies. The types of mummies or classifications is called a taxonomy. So this was also produced by Dr. After Heidi in his book, The Scientific Study of Mummies. And we'll go through these briefly and then look at some examples on the next few slides. The first classification or type of mummy is an artificial mummy, artificial mummification. And anthropogenic means that it's retained its morphologic shape, or it looks like the person that it was, or resembles that in some fashion. Now, another way to look at this artificial mummification is to call it intentional mummification, but we have to be careful with that term because there are other ways to intentionally mummify that aren't artificial. Artificial implies that something has been done to the body to make sure that it is preserved. The next classification is the natural mummification, or spontaneous or an accidental mummy. These are mummies that are produced by their environment, by a dry crypt, by desert sands. Next are spontaneous enhanced mummifications, which I'll describe in a moment. And finally, intermediate mummification, or time-targeted mummification. You only want the body to last a little while. First, artificial mummification, anthropogenic. Remember, these are cultures who intentionally altered or treated the body in some way to allow it to resist decay. The Chinchorro, who are an ancient culture that inhabited the Atacama Desert in northern Chile and southern Peru, were the first people on the planet known to produce mummies. The Chinchorro were actually mummified 2,000 years before the Egyptians. And they had a really elaborate mummification technique, but it was artificial. It was intentional. They took a lot of resources to make the mummies that they made, and we'll be talking about them later on. The Egyptians. Egyptians are probably the best known artificial mummy makers in the world. Once again, not the very first, but we know so much about them from their hieroglyphs, from their writings, from modern experimentation. The Egyptian mummy has become quite a science, quite a base for the scientific study of mummies. And again, they're artificial mummies. They were intentionally made. Sideshow mummies. This is an interesting group of North American mummies in which someone died in the late 18th century, so the late 19th century, so the late 1800s. I get that a little screwed up. They died and no one claimed their body, and communications being what they were in those days. So a sideshowman or an entrepreneur would say, "Oh, that's my brother Bob," and they'd buy the body or pay whoever had been keeping the body for the short time, and they would actually mummify that body and take it out on the carnival circuit. So these were intentionally made, and they usually used a heavy metal solution like arsenic to produce those mummies. Then there are mummies of Oceania and Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, places in Australia where they actually used a smoking technique to artificially mummify their dead. The Inca, too, had artificial mummification techniques, and there are several reports of that. Also, the Roman Catholic Church would actually produce saints. They made the claim that these were incorruptibles, but later came clean and said, no, we actually made these mummies, borrowing probably some of the science from what was known of Egyptian mummification at the time. So a lot of the saints that are supposedly incorruptibles are, in actuality, intentional or artificial mummies. The next classification, natural mummification or spontaneous. These are mummies that are produced by their environment. Something in the environment stopped decay. The bog bodies found in the Netherlands, Ireland, Scotland, Denmark, where the bog is a very acidic environment. There are also tanning properties. So a combination of the environment that these bodies found themselves in produced preserved tissues and therefore mummies, natural mummification. Nobody put somebody in the bog thinking that they were going to make a mummy. The soap lady is a good example of a unique type of mummification called soponification, and that requires an alkaline environment. We'll be looking into that in some detail. So again, it's the environment that individual or those individuals are buried in that leads to soponification. The High Andes Inca. These are some very famous mummies that you probably are aware of. These child mummies were placed as sacrifices on the peaks of mountains in the Andes. It's very dry, very cold, and the process of mummification was probably pretty quick because they're extremely well preserved. Otzi, the Iceman, in the near Tyrolia, the Iceman is preserved, in this case, not by the dry air on a mountaintop, but because he was encased in a glacier. Again, by the environment. Peru, one group of people called the Chiribaya buried their dead in the Atacama Desert. And in the Atacama Desert, it's a very alkaline soil. It never rains in the Atacama Desert. So there was rapid drying out or rapid desiccation that stopped decay, and we had natural mummies. Crypt mummies in Italy, Ireland, and Europe, and other locations. These crypt mummies, they're cool, dry locations, and this again causes rapid desiccation and produces an accidental or a spontaneous mummy. There's a famous group of mummies in Mexico found in Guanajuato at the Museo de las Momias, and these were not crypts that were underground, but these mummies came from crypts that were above the ground. And in this case, and we'll look at the Guanajuato mummies in some detail later on. This was a fascinating group of mummies, and it gives us a nice a longitudinal view. Jerry and I have studied the entire collection by now. The entire collection gives us a longitudinal view of life in this area of Mexico, and all the individuals were naturally mummified and naturally selected by the environment. Even here in North America, the Anasazi culture put their dead in cliffs in the Four Corners area, and there was a great amount of ventilation. There is a drying aspect to that wind. It was warm or cold, and with the wind and the ventilation in these shallow caves, natural mummies occurred. Now, the spontaneous enhanced mummification is probably one of the more unique, and Peru, again, is a good example. This is where a culture discovers that if they put their dead in this area of the sand, a mummy will be produced. So they use they use the environment, the characteristics of the environment to make mummies. So it is intentional to make the mummy, but it's not artificial. They didn't do anything special. There was no processing to the mummy themselves. The mummies in this area of Peru, as well as other areas of South America, there's evidence that the mummies were brought out for ceremonies. They were redressed. We've seen mummies with as many as 10 and 11 wrappings around them. There's evidence that they've been fed. New food has been laid out for them within their individual tomb that's below the ground. So that's an example of spontaneous enhanced mummification. The last classification of mummy, last in our taxonomy, is the intermediate mummification, or time-targeted. Scan to the bottom of the slide, and that's what we do with standard embalming, as we embalm our dead in modern funerary practices today. We embalm the individual. We have our showing or our wake period in which family members travel to come see and give their last respects. And then the individual, after ceremony, is buried. And after time, they actually decay. The same concept occurred during the Civil War. In fact, it began during the Civil War, trying to get bodies from the South, the battlefields of the South, back up to the North. Time-targeted embalming would occur using heavy metals. And then they intended this to be intermediate mummification, but actually some of the Civil War dead actually became mummified. And it would be called artificial mummification. Not necessarily intentional, but artificial, because they were treated with this arsenic or nickel and zinc and other heavy metals in solution as an embalming fluid. And then they would travel to the north, have their ceremony, and be buried. But if you look at them now, many of them are mummified. And on the Aborigines of Darnley Island, in more ancient cultures, this is another good example of a time target or intermediate mummification. They would mummify their dead for a period of time that would allow people to come from distant parts on foot, go through their funerary rituals, and finally bury the individuals, and they would in fact decay. So now we've looked at the taxonomy of mummies. We know what a mummy is by definition. We know the origin of the term. We've looked at the taxonomy or classifications, which included the artificial mummification, natural mummification, spontaneous enhanced mummification, and of course intermediate mummification, as we have on the slide here. So from this basis, we're going to be able to now spring forward on into the course. We're going to be looking at a whole lot of different mummies, and we're going to fit them into these classifications, and we're going to make sure that they're defined properly as a mummy. Thank you very much for your kind attention to Module 1, Units 2 and 3. We'll see you in the next module.